Welcome, one and all, to this amazing podcast webinar series. It's the regular deep dive. We aren't tired of saying that yet. Into the weird and wonderful world of strata and management rights in Queensland. So I am Chris Irons, director of an outfit called Stratasolve. That's stratasolve.com.au. Alongside me is Frank Higginson, partner at Heinz Legal, leading provider of strata legal and management rights services in the sector. Frank, hello.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone, again, for what is going to be a bloody interesting topic.
Well, they're all interesting, aren't they, to varying degrees? But we think this one in particular. So before we sort of get into the substance, just a bit of housekeeping. If you're listening in via YouTube, you can post your questions in the YouTube chat function. We'll try and get to those. But if you're listening in later on while you're out walking the dog or doing the dishes or whatever, you can find all the notes and the links that we refer to at heinzlegal.com.au. Frank, this week, EV, electric vehicles in strata.
Yes. Lots of chat, not much doing yet in my experience with these. I think it's sort of, but, it's incredibly topical. And, to be fair, it's not going away anytime soon. So we thought we might as well grab the bull by the horns and have a conversation about, and I suppose what it means for bodies corporate in Queensland. So different states are going to have different rules. So this is definitely not, I suppose some of the issues we're talking about will be national, but in terms of when we get into the legislative specifics, it's going to be very Queensland orientated. But even I was talking to two mates the other day about cars. I'm not a car person in the slightest. And both of them have got Teslas on order. It's like, really? It's just everywhere. So it's something Strata absolutely has to deal with.
Now, we did reach out to Elon for a guest appearance in today's webinar. He's busy. I guess he's doing something with Twitter or whatever.
Sending rockets to Mars.
Yeah, all of that sort of stuff. What's really interesting, before we delve into the sort of that stuff you just spoke about, Frank, what's really interesting to me is the ideological fervour that people approach EVs with, both for and against. I mean, like you, Frank, I'm not a mega car person. Cars are great. I like them, but they're still a vehicle. That's what they are. But the people who are so passionate about EV, and then other people who are just opposed, just for purely ideological grounds, it's extraordinary.
It is. Now, and anecdotally, I was going to say, I got interviewed at one stage. It was Channel 7 News. This is, I suppose, it used, for me, the world used to be divided as pre and post GFC. I suppose now it's pre and post COVID. It was a pre-COVID interview, and they were questioning about electric vehicles, and I got a 2-second sound grab in terms of absolutely it's going to cause fights because there's inconsistent views on them and all that sort of stuff. So that was great, a little snippet on the Channel 7 News, watched it that night, and then I started to get notifications on my Twitter, which is Frank Higginson, and people have looked me up off the Channel 7 link and started hopping into me about, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. It's like, what? And I wasn't pre or anti or for, but it's just, this is what's going to happen. And it's like, bloody hell.
It's happened to me as well. Not quite as much as that, but happened to me as well. Now, normally we'd just say that's got nothing to do with us, except in this case, those ideological differences may yet play a part in some of the strata side of things. So we will delve into that. Bit of context around this issue. So the 2022 federal budget in Australia, put up a link to that, offered incentives and tax breaks for EV purchases. So where we're coming from, I suppose, is you've got governments saying that there are legitimate financial reasons for going down an EV path. So I suppose, to be really blunt, Frank, you may love EVs, you may loathe them. What you can't avoid is that this is the wave of the future. You're just going to... So then it's about mitigation, dealing with it, and dealing with it thoroughly. The peak body, SCA, Australian Community Association, of which you and I, Frank, are both members, has actually gone out there and talked about the need for some kind of government intervention, and we'll try and touch upon that a little bit in this event, and we'll put up a link to that statement as well. Watch this space, I suppose, when it comes to government reform. Okay, enough of that hoo-ha. Let's rip into this. So, Frank, when we're talking about EV and Strata, really, there's one of two main categories we're talking about here: new buildings and existing buildings, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I suppose new buildings will be, and this is one of the really interesting things with Strata as well, is you've got, they talk about Strata as being the fourth tier of government. New buildings absolutely have a substantial involvement of the third tier of government, which is local government, their local authorities, and they have the ability to make rules about planning for their individual needs on their own basis. So that's not regulated by the state. The state gives them the ability to make those rules, and then they can make those rules as they see fit, and I suppose as the electorate's required and so on. So Brisbane City Council is going to have different rules for Brisbane CBD than what Surfers Paradise might have with respect to Gold Coast City Council, and what's going to be in Port Douglas and Bowen, or Emerald or Moranbah or whatever it might be. So to me, new buildings are really interesting in terms of what local authorities might require at some stage in relation to provision of services for EVs, and whether they're you occasionally see the approval which has said that the building's going to have 2 EVs or a car spots. I've seen those when you're not giving a car park per lot, there might be sort of some shared cars around that, but that'll be interesting. So new buildings, I think, is completely in the hands of each local authority.
Yeah, and I think in California, I think it is, Frank, they've already gone down the path of mandating as a whole that kind of thing for new buildings. I think in other parts of the world as well, and I think eventually that's where it gets to here. That's just my view. So that's that. And so the questions there are questions as they relate to new buildings. So, has the scheme complied with its development approval? Is this properly recorded in the CMS? And so on and so on. We're going to put up a link to something that New South Wales government has published here, just as a bit of a guide. And I think there's a bit of an overview about what we're talking about in terms of complexity. It is New South Wales specific, but my goodness, it's an in-depth document about how EV can get treated in Strata. Which then leads us on to existing buildings, which I think, Frank, is where the trickiness will really arise here.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to depend completely on the age of the building, where it's located, what its capacity is, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. And even knowing that we were having this, I was talking to a mate that's got an EV the other day and lives in a newish building at Portside, and so you got chargers down there? I said, no, I don't. So what he does is when he's driving out and about, he'll charge up at a supercharger somewhere and then drive home and not use the building's electricity and that sort of stuff. So that's how he's dealing with it at the moment. And this is the thing, what absolutely is going to be coming is people who have electric vehicles wanting the convenience of being able to do it straight downstairs. Yep. So for existing buildings, and lots of them are facing it, but how each person or each building is dealing with it, I wouldn't say problematic. It just depends on the building and probably the committees and all that sort of stuff as to how the head in the sand approach, I don't want to deal with it, or trying to charge on relentlessly to get stuff in there.
And so I guess it's about a bunch of questions, isn't it, Frank? It's this, so how many stations are needed? What's going to be the impact on electricity, the utility infrastructure of the building? How long will it take? And of course, who pays and in what proportion? So all of those will be the questions that each strata scheme will have to deal with if it's not blanket mandated in another way, I suppose. My understanding, Frank, there are plenty of businesses out there who are marketing themselves as providing solutions in this area. Now, I'm not in a position to endorse any of them, assuming you aren't either, Frank. I don't know. I guess the bottom line, though, as with anything, you'll need to take expert advice on this before any decisions are made, one way or the other.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the concerns that clients are raising with me when I talk to them about it is redundancy. You know, technology moves so quickly. If we put something in, if we press the button on something today to be installed in 8 months' time, how do we know in 3 years' time there's not something better? And I mean, the answer is you don't. You remember you used to pay 10 grand for a 42-inch plasma television. Now you can pick them up for $300 or whatever it might be via Kogan. That same thing might appear. And I know that I've got another client that's looking at it. It's a fairly large. It is a high-rise building across a large area of land, which means that their car park is really one level underneath the whole building, and they're wondering whether they can stage the installation of bits of infrastructure. And what that's going to mean is that people, you know, in the first stage get access, but people in stage 3 are waiting for who knows how long to be able to hook that in. So it's all those sort of questions are really difficult ones to manage.
And is that a reasonable decision to make under the circumstances? I guess this all eventually leads us to the sort of the ins and outs of common property usage and using utility infrastructure. So I think as anybody who's ever listened to one of these would know by now, you'd hope, is that when you talk about common property, you know it's extremely regulated, how it gets used, how others can use it. So assuming that we're talking about installation of EV facilities on and using common property, that's what we need to talk about. So I guess, Frank, we talk about things like improvement to common property by an owner. We're talking about possibly exclusive use bylaws as well.
Because I mean, these things are if you're going to go get one of the superchargers in the car parks, like probably every car park in a high rise are going to be common property, then installing one of those things into that car park is an improvement to common property.
And then we also might even get into the area of leasing. So say, for example, if there's going to be a portion of common property leased to a third party provider for the purpose of supplying EV facilities, leasing is a whole other story, isn't it, Frank?
Absolutely, because it doesn't indicate permanence, and that's the difficulty with leasing. You know, you've got your different statutory thresholds in terms of 3 and 10 years, and depends which module you're in. But either way, at the end of the lease, the ownership of that asset or the right to use it reverts back to the body corporate, which is distinct from an exclusive use grant, which lasts forever and attaches to the lot and whoever owns it. You know, and I suppose one of the other questions that comes up all the time is, why don't we just put them in the visitor car parks? It's like, well, the people using it then aren't visitors. It's not quite as convenient as leaving it in your car park, because you've got to come back and unplug it at some stage. And then, of course, the inevitable with council, if it's actually a visitor's car park meant for visitors and occupiers are using it to charge their EVs on rotation, are the car parks available for visitors? The answer is probably no. So you've got to breach the DA. So is there another area you might be able to create that has a charger there that people can use that isn't a visitor car park? And maybe you put something in the bylaws to regulate the use of that, a booking system or something, and that might be a way to go. But usually there's not spare car parks sitting around buildings. They're built to the number.
And so each of those options that we just spoke about come with a different approval process under the legislation and a different threshold, as I think you just alluded to, Frank. So if you're talking about improvement to a common property, so long as the improvement is over $3,000, which you would assume it would be here, then that's something that needs to be approved by ordinary resolution at a general meeting. But you also need to think about things like nuisance and bylaws and hazard, one of our new favourite words on this broadcast, hazard. And there's all sorts of hoo-ha about alleged hazards from EVs. We'll get to that in just a bit more in a minute. Because if you're thinking about leasing, Frank, that's typically a resolution without dissent, isn't it?
If you're going to go for more than 10 years, absolutely. So in effect, it's a disposal of common property for an extended period, but not permanent. So if you're going to lease something for more than 10 years, you might as well just do a resolution without dissent. It's the same threshold level. And I think it's worth, I suppose, covering that we're going to put up a couple of links to newsletters about spending limits we'll talk about in a minute, and also a webinar we did on maintenance versus improvements, which you'd think two words that don't mean much, but in Strata they mean a hell of a lot.
So it all comes down, well, not always, but in this case, it'll come down to money. So who's going to be footing the bill here and how? So some people will say, well, if you are an EV owner, then it's up to you to foot the bill for that. I don't know it's quite that simple, particularly if others may be using it along the way. Frank, what about a bylaw? Can we have a bylaw that is putting a cost on EV users?
Well, one of the very you can have a bylaw that attaches to a grant of exclusive use.
Mm-hmm.
So bylaws ordinarily can't impose monetary liabilities other than with exclusive use bylaws. So easiest example might be a courtyard where people pay a notional annual rent under the bylaws or something like that, as much as that's very uncommon. I think the difficulty with this, once you plug it in your car park, that might be your piece of infrastructure there, but the piece of infrastructure to get from the wall through whatever the common property is to get to the mains where the thing's connected is going to be utility infrastructure, which is a body corporate asset. So I think I can't see granting exclusive use over something like that on a condition of a payment or it being built for a single owner is going to make a whole lot of sense, because that also then requires a resolution without dissent. So to me, that spine piece has to be body corporate, because again, if more than one person is ever going to use it, that's what it needs to be. And then it's about cost recovery, maybe not of the capital, but certainly with respect to the ongoing electricity charges, isn't it?
That's right. And then we're going to put up a link to an adjudicator's order in relation to cost recovery. That will hopefully illustrate that point a bit more. In terms of paying, of course, there are spending limits. And Frank, you talked about the newsletter, which we'll put up the link to. So the committee's got a spending limit, and if it exceeds that spending limit, it goes to a general meeting, which is where the issues about ideology will really start to kick in at that point, because if you've got people there who don't have an EV and have no intention of ever getting an EV, and there will be people like that, I would expect, in many buildings, they'll just vote no, and quite possibly go out there and advocate for everybody else to vote no. And then we haven't even spoken about loans, where a loan might actually require a resolution without dissent, depending upon the size and the regulation module of said loan. I guess the big question in all of this, before we move off the topic of cost, common property, and all the rest of it, will be people out there saying, oh, and I've had this in a seminar recently, I just don't know what we need to do. I'm on the committee and I don't know what we need to do. Neither do I. I'm not an electrician. Don't think you are, Frank, unless you skills that I didn't know about.
Definitely not.
I'm certainly not an engineer either. So you're going to have to talk to someone who has expertise, and that's the bottom line here. And you can't be making decisions like this unless you know. And I would expect that not that many people would have that kind of detailed expertise. You need the objective information before you make a decision one way or another.
I reckon probably the experience, again, if you've got a Strata manager, which you probably will have, talking to them about whether anyone in their portfolio of buildings has put this stuff in, I think it would be an exceptional start in terms of, because it's always the pioneers that get the arrows. So the first ones through are going to be the ones that are trying to figure out, hang on, how's this work and all that sort of stuff. And even my brother's a professional boat captain, and every time Caterpillar comes out with a new engine, he always says to me, Frank, never ever buy the first version, get the second, because the bugs will have been worked out in the first one by someone else. Yeah. And so this will be out there, but it is absolutely a place for expert advice, because you just don't. Yeah, electrical infrastructure is complicated stuff, and loads and all that sort of thing. How does it actually work? Because it all sounds good in theory for you and I to sit here to talk about improvements to common property and spending limits and stuff, but the stuff still needs to work and needs to be fair across everyone, because not everyone's going to be charging at the same time, but it's got to be equitable.
That's right. We've talked a little bit about those kind of ideological issues. Let's delve into that just a teeny bit more. We said before that some people who, I guess it's an Elon thing, that just don't like EVs, and well and good, don't have to. So where there are emotions about EV, maybe about spending or about granting access or ability to approve common property, and there's a fair bit of opposition in the scheme from an anti-EV cohort. So what then? Frank, let's just say that somebody says, you know what, I don't like EVs and I'm never going to buy one, therefore I vote no. Is that reasonable opposition, Frank?
Well, I think voting no because you don't like something, I think on its own isn't necessarily the solution. And this is, mate, one of the things I learned from you when we were working together is the why. The why is, why don't you like EVs? And it might be that I'm terrified about fire risk. If one of these batteries goes off, how safe is our basement? You know, and that's what someone was telling me the other day, because you talk to people about these things, and I don't know. I don't know what QFES's position on this stuff is. I don't know whether they've going to change. Probably fire safety rules might be different. Is it more risky with a building of 50 EVs than one? Probably the answer is yes if it jumps. So is that a valid concern? It may well be. And then I suppose we go into the Commissioner's office, and it might be that one adjudicator is a bit greener than the next adjudicator.
No, what?
You would know more about that than most, Chris. So the cast and aspersions, because it's a very subjective thing.
Yeah.
And you'd look at government. Government's clearly driving people towards electric vehicles, but it's not quite supported because, again, in legislation, there's nothing there about this at all, is there? We're sort of bringing together a group of different pieces, and it might be, who knows, what government's view, because, again, community title legislation law reform working group hasn't come up for discussion yet, has it?
No, but I reckon watch this space. And then, of course, all of this leads to the issue of lobbying. So if you happen to be an EV owner and your building is absent of the facilities that you need or you want, and you have sort of done the research, come to a conclusion about what's needed and determining that that's going to need a particular resolution type and a particular kind of approval, then you need to go out there and make sure you've got the numbers for it. And that's where you'll need to actually address some of these points that have come up. So, if somebody does have some concerns about fire, you'll need to be in a position to address that. Well, actually, no, here's some research which tells us differently. Or here's a position paper from a government authority which tells us another thing. This is where
here's the documentary by Mythbusters.
Yeah, exactly. All of the above. Yeah. But engaging in an emotive argument on the floor of the general meeting where this is being discussed is a pointless exercise at that point, I would suggest. What about the poor old tenant, Frank, or the occupier?
Well, we went through the process about whether tenants were going to have the right to have a representative on committees and put motions to bodies corporates, and the answer is no to date. So as much as I think that is the case in New South Wales now, is there a tenant representative down there? Yeah, so haven't got that far in Queensland. So tenants can really only speak to a body corporate in general meeting through their lotto or through their owner or their landlord. But I think probably the thing that will be most interesting, 1 October 2023, new minimum housing standards, which are yet to be put out there, will arrive. What might they say about electric vehicles?
There is provision in the draft, so we haven't seen the detail of it, but there's certainly provision in the draft for, and I can't quite remember the term used, but I think it's energy saving devices or words to that effect. Now, would that mean EV infrastructure facilities? I'm pretty sure it would. Reading, and again, you've got to read the room on this sort of stuff, don't you, Frank? We have a government, and this is not a value judgment, but we have a government that is prioritising a pro-tenant reform agenda, and a fairly strong renewables agenda. So combine the two.
And in Brisbane particularly, at both local, state and now federal government, we have green representatives in Parliament or the governing bodies. So that in itself is going to point towards electric vehicles, isn't it?
That's right. And depending upon the state of the rental market too, a building that offers EV charging for occupiers might actually be quite attractive, depending upon the kind of tenant that you are talking about. And look, at the end of the day, if there is a situation where the occupier, which is the technical term for a tenant under legislation, is utilising common property without proper authorisation for their EV, action will need to be taken by the body corporate in that case.
Ideally under the bylaws in terms of accessing infrastructure for your own personal purposes. And that's that cost recovery bit that I think is really important. There's a statutory obligation to do it.
What about this idea, to sort of coming to the end, Frank, but what about this idea of capital value then? I'm a big believer, and I've said it quite a few places, that again, notwithstanding your views on EV, we're talking about an improvement to your capital value, I would have thought.
I think so. And I suppose, like, I'm no valuer, so valuers would be interesting, and you're going to have arguments if you're pro EV and you think it's going to add capital value. A letter of advice from a valuer to go around with the material would probably be a good place to start. But I look at it and say, if you've got two units side by side that for all intents and purposes are otherwise identical, same aspect, same size, same amenity, blah, blah, blah. One has electric vehicle capacity and the other one doesn't. To me, it follows that the one with EV has to be more attractive to people, which in theory should lead to potential higher returns and price.
I would have thought so.
Buyers that have EVs are not going to look at renting or buying that unit because they don't have that capacity, if the one beside it does. That's the one they'll go to.
Let's follow this through on a purely economic basis. Cars which use fuel based on fossil fuel may end up paying more and more and more for that for various reasons. But then on the flip side of that, government offers, as we've just talked about, incentives and tax breaks for getting into EV, particularly if government goes down the path of offering incentive or a tax break for EV infrastructure, Frank. That would be a huge dip. So again, you've got two competing economic forces there. If people are going to follow the path which offers them the best economic outcome, and the building does not meet that economic imperative, it's hard to see how that would not have a negative impact on property values. That's how I see it anyway.
Yep.
Yep. We are approaching the finale today, and there's a lot to take in there. And I think we've spoken a lot here about possible and maybe and what we think. And again, I think we were just talking off air before we started, Frank. I think we think that government will step in here in the not too distant future and put provisions around all of this. But before that, I think the only best practice that we can offer here is know what the hell you're talking about.
Yes. It is new territory and it's complicated. So, and I suppose it must have happened in some buildings, not that they've come across our desks yet, but it's probably a lot to go wrong. And there is a lot of moving parts from a legislative perspective. So until government probably makes it easier in terms of here's a very clear channel to run at a lower threshold to be able to get this stuff done, sort of be alert, not necessarily alarmed, but dot your I's, cross your T's, and really understand what it is you're doing.
Avoid being a bush lawyer about it. Avoid being an amateur engineer, or whatever the case may be. I think that's the surest path to a problem coming to fruition on this one. And look, Elon, if you happen to be watching, happy to chat with you at your opinions on this. Why would you not? On that topic, on that note. All time we have for this week. There's quite a bit of resources that go with today's discussion, as we highlighted. That, as Frankie, I think you said it really well just then. So many moving parts to this particular issue as it stands. So you can find all of those links that we've mentioned at heinzlegal.com.au. That's where you can also find Frank, by the way. Not maybe literally, but eventually when you work your way through. You can find me at stratasolve.com.au. Until next time, Frank, that was good. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated.